For more analysis on the trade war and the future of Huawei, here is Parag Khanna. He's the author of The Future is Asian, and he joins us from Singapore. Parag, I would love to get your quick take on some of the Huawei news that just hit the wires.
Right. Well, I think that this temporary reprieve or extension is not really a surprise to anyone, not only because the Trump administration wants to keep that as something of a bargaining chip, but also, as you've already mentioned, the kind of the corporate interests at stake from the U.S. side in terms of the chip manufacturers who can now continue to sell to Huawei, and they represent a pretty substantial share of Huawei's component imports from the United States. So I think this one was fairly predictable. The question is, of course, it's just 90 days. And, we see, as you've also said, and I agree, China digging in a bit. So I don't think that the situation in 90 days would necessarily be that different. Only that, of course, the decoupling between the U.S. and China will be that much more evolved. And so in that sense, China's incentive to, come rushing to the table or something like that is actually going to incrementally decrease, not increase. So on that one, I'm obviously going to disagree with the Trump administration's view of the trajectory of this whole dynamic.
Parag, our reporter Akiko Fujita recently sat down with the CEO of Huawei. She got a tour of the campus as well there in China. And the CEO said to her that if the U.S. leaves Huawei out, it's actually going to hurt the U.S. more, especially when it comes to rolling out 5G. Would you agree with that?
Well, I mean, there's multiple dimensions to that question in terms of, the U.S. is one of the countries that has the capacity, even though it's been slow to deploy it as rapidly and at scale as China wants to do. But, we have the capability to do it, so we don't necessarily have to have Huawei to do so. But in terms of the international markets and competition, we already know that Huawei has moved, quite rapidly ahead. Indeed, the sort of, the head-to-head, if you will, with Huawei has been playing out much more internationally than merely with respect to U.S. companies selling components to Huawei. It's been much more about which countries, Germany, France, UK, Canada, Australia, India, what are going to be their responses to Huawei, where that company has already been making significant inroads. So, one of the things that the Huawei chairman has been saying for a long time is whether or not we get into the U.S. market, whether or not we're allowed to expand in the U.S. market, the fact is we have the whole rest of the world. So this isn't really necessarily about Huawei's role in the U.S. in terms of that question. It's also just about Huawei's ability to remain the global player that it is with, 30+% market share in certain categories of telecommunications equipment.
Parag, how bad a position is Apple right now looking out over the next 12 months? Certainly saw Tim Cook meet with the president over the past couple of days.
Well, I want to agree wholeheartedly with what Andy said earlier. This expression, don't put all your eggs in the China basket, is one I've been using for a long time. It's the predominant theme of my new book, saying that Asia is a lot bigger than just China. And if you look at Apple's dependency on the China factor, to drive its international growth, that has been unstable for some time, given the indigenous competition in China, obviously, from so many other fast rising brands, high quality products. They're very, very small market share, less than 2% in the country. So yes, they do want to push now abroad, but there are a couple of problems they run up against. No other country, no other developing market with a low-cost labor force offers that integrated technological and manpower ecosystem that China does, where, as there's a couple of effectively cities that have been built just to, assemble Apple phones. India doesn't have that. Vietnam doesn't have that. So it's easy to look at a map and say, we'll just relocate there. It's a lot harder to actually do it. Let's also bear in mind something that people haven't paid enough attention to, but they're going to have to. As American multinationals do push their supply chains, to pull them out of China to other countries, even when you relocate to a, more open, more liberal, democratic, even, market economy, a place like India, they too have industrial policies. They're making significant demands around procuring from local suppliers, technology transfer, these kinds of things. So it's going to be a bumpy ride and a headache. There isn't going to be one country that can substitute for China.